to bring on board Amit Tandon, the founder and managing director at IiAS, joining in on the show right now to talk about how this entire investor activism theory is actually building up with IDFC now under the radar. Amit, great to have you on the show. The IDFC Foundation is, quite a complicating factor, if I can put it as that. Will the sale of the AMC business, you think, be enough to pave the way out?
Look, IDFC has been interesting, and I think the call last week was very telling in the way that, investor after investor actually spoke to the management and said that, look, we've been speaking to you for quite a while now about what you're unlocking value. And in this instance, it was pretty much with regard to the sale of the mutual fund. They want the mutual fund to be sold and the proceeds to be distributed as dividend. And as I said, investor after investor spoke about it and said that, look, we don't really understand the reason for the delay, while you've been citing regulatory issues, et cetera, et cetera. As investors, you should have, as a company, you should have been on the front foot. And at the end of the day, they said that, look, you've kind of completely disregarded what we were saying. What was actually telling about the call was the ferocity with which the investors have kind of pushed back on this issue. So investors are patient, but up to a point, and clearly in this instance, they lost patience. And since Mr. Vinod Rai had come up for reappointment, they said that, look, as chairman, you should have had 1 year to the ground, figuring out what the investors are wanting. And therefore, they kind of vented their ire by voting overwhelmingly against his appointment.
Sure. Amit, the news just in that Pricewaterhouse has actually resigned as the statutory auditors for IDFC, and Khimji Kuverji and company has been appointed as the new auditors. Could that in any way help speeden up the process?
Look, I don't think the auditor has much of a role. And, if you look at it, that resolution for appointing Khimji Kuverji was there in the AGM, and that had come as an addendum, and therefore shareholders had kind of voted on it. Look, the auditors don't have a significant role in this. This is kind of pretty much driven by the company, the management, what they're thinking about, etc. I just had one issue as far as Mr. Vinod Rai is concerned, which is that, there would have been a handful of investors who were a little bit uncomfortable, given the fact that he kind of recategorized himself from an independent director to a non-independent director. As an independent director, he would have had 2 terms of 3 years each. His term was getting over, I think it was getting over at end July, but before that, sometime in May, there was a meeting of the NRC when he resigned and therefore got himself reappointed. Now, this kind of caused a little bit of, I would say the investors really weren't sure about in terms of what had happened, because when a director resigns, a good practice is that, you kind of share this with the stock exchange, what the reason is. Of course, the company's got a different interpretation of that as well, to say that, look, SEBI regulations kicked in much later and so on and so forth. But, in some of these instances, and particularly in the case of Mr. Vinod Rai, who's been CAG and therefore is very mindful of the fact and aware of the fact that each I needs to be dotted and each T needs to be crossed. The fact that, there was something like this which happened made the investors a little bit uncomfortable in terms of what has happened, what happened in the meeting, why could it not have kind of continued till the end of July. But look, that to my mind was a little bit of a technical issue. But coming back, the primary issue seems to be that, look, you don't have your ear to the ground. As a chairman, you should. And it brings to the fore the need for, we have a stakeholder empowerment committee, which all the boards have. And, this was something which was it's a kind of fallback to the earlier Companies Act when, there were a lot of issues with when you had physical transfer of shares, dividends not being received. Now, while we've continued with that committee, its role is kind of needs to be relooked at For long, our view is that, look, the stakeholder empowerment committee should have senior members of the board, which are kind of engaging with the institutional shareholders and other shareholders, and at one level, other stakeholders, to understand how are they thinking about the company, what are the processes which they believe work, what are the changes which need to be, which need to happen, what are the tweaks. So therefore, I think it's a time for companies to re-look at the stakeholder empowerment committee, who's there. Companies are a little bit wary of getting their independent directors to meet up with investors, but I think that is going to change. You may not get the independent directors talking or answering questions, but certainly they should be listening to what investors and other stakeholders are saying.
You know, during an investor call earlier the month, the shareholders did express concern, right, about the inability to sell the asset management business. I don't know if that is one of the reasons why we have seen Mr. Vinod Rai not coming back on the board and things like that. But it is a complex sale that was also explained on the investor call. How are we supposed to see all of this together? And now it's being compounded by the resignation of PwC as a statutory auditor.
Look, as I said, I haven't, we did see that there were going to be two auditors. I haven't looked at, if PwC, the term was there, or, and it could well happen because of the news, the new RBI guidelines, which they've kind of put in place. And therefore, you will see some amount of churn with auditors in the financial services space because of the regulations. And my sense, intuitive sense is that is it. I'll have to go back and look at a little bit about what has happened. On the sale, you're absolutely right. It is a complex process. We saw L&T Mutual Fund trying to sell itself. They had a private equity buyer. SEBI kind of turned around and, had definitive views in terms of whether it could be private equity or whether they need someone with, who has a strategic interest in the business rather than someone who is seen to be a financial investor. So, of course, we do believe that some private equity could be strategic as well, given the fact that they are managing money for people. So, therefore, there are, I would say, some of these unknowns which they face. But nonetheless, the view which investors took was that, look, there were structures which were possible. We kind of spent our own money, gotten legal advice, and you kind of just disregarded everything and said that, look, we are going to do things at our own pace rather than get driven by what the concerns of the investors are. And I can imagine investors would be frustrated that, it's not something which we look at, but you can't ignore it, which is what's happening to the share price. And they would have seen that the whole market has kind of moved up. And here's a company in a sector which is kind of benefited from the tailwinds which have been there, and you've kind of pretty much stuck where you are without anything happening to the share price. And that would have added to their frustrations that, look, you had a solution, you could have addressed the problem, but just by dragging your feet, you've let things be.
Amit, to sum up, and you have a very unique position in this, in that you advise shareholders based on everything that you see. So you're kind of seeing the whole picture. Can you tell us what steps the management will now have to take to set things in order very quickly?
Well, the management already made an announcement that, look, we are going to be doing our, we're kind of setting a target for ourselves to be, selling the asset management business in 1 year. They also have some other residual assets, and you'll have to kind of address that. But my sense is that the value is in the asset management business. And of course, they hold the shares in the bank. Now, whether they kind of distribute shares in everything, they kind of collapse the two entities. I'm really not in I don't have a good enough sense in terms of what they're doing, but I think, the fact that they need to act immediately, not let things drag on, is very clear. And I would, just sitting outside looking in, one would expect that, they've got a very short timeline in which they need to act and to address the various issues which the investors have brought out in the call last week.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that, Amit Tandon, but thanks a lot for joining us live today on the market. That's a lot to talk about. You know, the Vinod Rai being not getting re-voted to the board. Let's see how this pans out. PwC has resigned as a statutory auditor, and of course, it's a complicated sale as far as the disinvestment of the AMC business goes. And shareholders have figured out activism and to get the way they want. Remember, the market regulator, SEBI chief Ajit Tyagi, recently said it's good shareholders are not following herd mentality, but instead using their mind.